Very happy to welcome everyone this evening to tonight's lecture, which continues the second phase of our exhibition, How Jews Became Citizens. Some of you here this evening may have been with us a couple weeks ago when Jessica Margolin from USC delivered a wonderful talk on the Sephardic experience in North Africa and the Mediterranean world more broadly. Tonight we're going to shift gears and move over into the area of Eastern Europe. And to get us started more formally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Miriam Mora, our Director of Programming, who will formally introduce Benjamin Nathans, this evening's speaker.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Dr. Miriam Mora, as Gav said. I'm the Director of Academic and Public Programming here at the Center for Jewish History, and I am excited to welcome you today for this talk with Dr. Benjamin Nathans, which is the second in a series of lectures that we're calling the Sid Lapidus lectures, pairing with our exhibit just around the corner, if you haven't had the chance to see it, called How Jews Became Citizens, which tells the complex ongoing story of the Jewish people's path to emancipation across Europe and across centuries. This program has been made possible by the generous support of Sid and Ruth Lapidus, as well as the New York State Council of the Arts and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. Tonight's Professor Nathans will explore why emancipation came so late to the Empire of the Tsars, what role Jews played in its arrival, and how the Bolshevik Revolution recast the meaning of emancipation itself, with consequences that are still with us today. I'll ask you to hold your questions until the end. There will be time for a Q&A, and I will come around with the microphone, so raise your hand, and that way we can have your voice for the recording that we're doing as well, so that we don't have to repeat it through the other mic. Benjamin Nathans is the Alan Charles Kors Associate Professor of History at Penn, specializing in modern Russia, the Soviet Union, modern Jewish history, and the history of human rights. He's the author of the prize-winning book, Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, and his forthcoming work, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. His work has appeared in The Economist, The Washington Post, The New York Review of Books, The Times Literary Supplement, and other venues. I'm delighted to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Nathans.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. It's great to be back at the Center for Jewish History, which I first started to visit as a graduate student before the constituent units came together. And my research was mostly at the YIVO Institute, which, well, there used to be a slide up here that listed it among the members of the Center for Jewish History. And that was back in the day when YIVO was at 86th and 5th Avenue and was my little piece of Eastern Europe right here on the Upper East Side. And it really is one of the truly great collections for historians of the Jews, a treasure that deserves to be well cared for. I'm honored to have been invited here tonight by Gabriel Rosenfeld and Miriam Mora for this lecture. And I want to thank all of you for coming. As you know, the lecture is connected to this exhibition under the title, How Jews Became Citizens. And I think it's worth beginning with a question, not a hypothetical question, a historical question. Can there be citizens in an autocratic state like Tsarist Russia? Can there be citizens in a totalitarian state such as the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin? I don't think either of these questions has a simple answer. The concept of citizenship often carries with it the sense of agency, the mastery of the self or control over the self, the ability to make certain kinds of decisions, political or otherwise, for oneself. Citizenship carries the connotation of public dignity. Being a citizen in a public space means to have a role that is a dignified one. Being a citizen means having the capacity to participate in some meaningful sense in public affairs. And these associations with the word that I think go beyond its purely legal meaning are particularly true in the Western world, but not only there. So the concept of emancipation, that is entrance into the status of citizen or of citizenship, turns out to be rather complicated, or as I'm calling it in my talk tonight, elusive emancipation in the case of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And it's elusive because of the Russian setting, but it's also elusive because freedom itself is elusive. And it can't be described purely in terms of the absence of legal discrimination based on religion or ethnicity or gender or any other category. But even if it doesn't tell the whole story, the story of legal emancipation, changes in legal structures as they regard the status of Jews in any given society. Or to put it more simply, the question of citizenship is in fact crucial because it tells us what the position of the state is vis-a-vis a given population, a given minority. And in the modern world, as I think you all know, and as Jews everywhere know, the position of the state on this question is often decisive. If you look at the history of Jewish emancipation in various countries, and part of the thinking behind this series, as I understand it, is to do a comparative look at the various paths of emancipation that Jews have experienced in different places and different times. If you look comparatively at this phenomena, the first thing that will jump out at you, and alluded to this, or maybe Miriam alluded to this in her introduction, is that Russian Jews were late to the party. Russian Jewry did not experience legal emancipation until the early 20th century. And if you were to plot on a map when Jews in other, let's just limit it to Europe, other European countries experienced emancipation, the story was almost over by then. The story that had begun with the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century and made its way in zigs and zags from west to east across the European continent. The only other country that entered the 20th century without yet having emancipated, legally emancipated its Jewish population was Romania. Romania is an interesting comparative case, but the Russian Empire is crucial in this regard because the Russian Empire in the early 20th century was home to the majority of the world's Jewish population. More Jews lived in that empire than lived in all other European countries and the United States combined. So you may think of emancipation as having played itself out across the 19th century, or the long 19th century, as historians like to call it, from the French Revolution of 1789 to the beginning of the First World War in 1914. But in fact, that story applies to a minority of the world's Jewish population. Most Jews entered the 20th century not yet having been legally emancipated. According to the first reliable census in the Russian Empire, it was conducted in 1897, there were just over 5 million Jews in that empire. So this is, as I said, the single largest Jewish community in the world, larger than all others combined. At the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, the most common, or one of the most common explanations for this delayed emancipation of Jews in Russia, at least as compared to its European neighbors, was that Russian Jewry was relatively backward compared to West European Jews. They were less likely to speak the language of the majority population, in this case, Ukrainian or Polish or Russian. They were less urbanized. They were less literate. They didn't have as many of the qualities that we associate with modernity as their counterparts in Western Europe, and that therefore they either didn't deserve to be emancipated yet, or they hadn't been able to marshal the necessary political will and political force to bring about emancipation in Russia. Another argument pointed elsewhere towards Russia's backwardness and the idea that Russia remained not just a monarchy, which was nothing unusual at the beginning of the 20th century, but a classic old regime that had somehow managed to get through the 19th century with almost none of the revolutionary shockwaves that were so productive of emancipation in Europe. I'm going to say more about that in a second. And what was most, I think, compelling about the argument that it was Russia's backwardness, not the Jews' backwardness, that explains the delay of emancipation, was that Russia was an old regime society in the sense that it didn't have a level playing field or kind of citizenship for any of its citizens. They were subjects of the Romanov dynasty, not citizens of Russia. And as a classic old regime society, there was one set of laws for the nobility and another set of laws for the peasantry, and yet another for the clergy, this classic hierarchical structure of society in which there's no claim of one law applies to everybody. This is what old regimes are like. It was true in France before the revolution. It was true in Italy. It was true in Germany. And so the argument is Russia was a delayed old regime that hadn't transitioned to a modern order of a level legal playing field with citizenship for all. And so why would it be surprising that the Jews were subject to a distinct body of law, since the whole society was a giant hierarchy of different punishments for different crimes depending on who you were. So one of the things I like to tell my students at Penn when I'm sort of describing what historians do and what history is about as a discipline is that it's a blend of art and science. It's an art in the sense that it relies on the telling of stories, but they're not stories that we make up. We carve stories out of what is true and what is documentable. But it has an unmistakable narrative dimension. It has characters, it has plot, it has climaxes, it has endings. It's a science in a very particular sense. It's not a science like physics or chemistry or biology. We don't conduct experiments. We don't have laboratories, although the Soviet Union was about as close to a human laboratory as we can get. Certainly, if you're an economist, it was, with the attempt to build socialism. But in general, historians are not laboratory scientists. We're not experimental scientists. We're scientists in a very specific meaning of the word. The meaning of science as in what, say, astronomers or geologists do. They don't conduct experiments either. They gather data. They gather data from the universe, or they gather data from planet Earth. They don't generate that data. Historians also don't generate data. We gather what history has left us. Sometimes it leaves us a lot, and sometimes it leaves us almost nothing. But the way we try to be scientists in our treatment of whatever data it is we can get access to is that we think comparatively. And that, to me, is what this series is trying to do. Think comparatively about the phenomenon of Jewish emancipation in the modern world by targeting case studies of different countries, different places, and different times, and seeing what is common among them and what's distinctive. That's what I want to do tonight. I want to try to situate this late arrival of emancipation in the Russian Empire and its afterlife in the Soviet era, and I'll say a little bit about Jews in the Russian Federation today. I want to situate all that in the context of a European-wide story of emancipation. I'm not going to push the story beyond Europe because that's more than enough to handle, and frankly, I'm not qualified to really speak about the topic outside a European and Russian context. So that's going to be my framework, and it's going to keep me plenty busy tonight. Once you start thinking about this problem comparatively, you have to ask yourself, is the Russian path a variation on a theme? Is it really distinctive? Does it really have its own architecture and its own dynamics? Now, before I get into this exercise of trying to put Russia in a larger framework and the experience of Russian Jewry in a larger framework, I have to say something about the terminology. I'm using the word Russian and Soviet when I talk about Russian Jewry and Soviet Jewry as a kind of shorthand to signify those Jews who lived in the Russian Empire and or the Soviet Union. But I have to tell you that this particular shorthand is being called into question today because of the war against Ukraine. And the field of study of Russia, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, that whole terrain that is so much in the headlines these days, is coming face to face with a process that scholars are calling decolonization. So there's a call to decolonize this field, which, to put it in plain English, means to stop treating Russia as the center of gravity of that part of the world. Yes, it's the largest country. Yes, it's the most powerful country. But the idea is, if we pay attention to our terminology, we're actually calling a lot of things Russian that aren't really Russia. That has to do with the Pale of Settlement, where the overwhelming majority of Jews live in the Russian Empire, which today we would call these territories Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine. So I don't have an elegant solution to this problem, but I want you to be aware that I'm using shorthand, which is now controversial because of this movement to decolonize the field and pay attention to the non-Russian elements more closely than we used to. Ironically, in Russian itself, there's a very helpful distinction that kind of finesses this problem. So you can talk about Ruski on the one hand, meaning Russian in the strict sense, ethnic Russian, but there's another term, Rossiyski, which refers to the imperial dimension, a multinational dimension of this problem. It's kind of like, but not exactly like, the difference between American and all American. So there's America, like the United States, and then there's the Americas. Remember Canada, Mexico, the other countries in North America. So we don't have an equivalent terminology in English, and I'm not going to try to invent one or foist it on you tonight. I just want you to be aware that this is a moving target now, and there's a political dimension to the language, as there always is. So if you look at the question of why and when emancipation came to Russia, why did it and why did it when it did? If you do that from a certain distance, I think this particular path is actually quite consistent with the European pattern, or at least it has very close parallels in virtually all of the European countries that emancipated their Jewish populations. So like Prussia, like Austria, like France, Russia acquired its Jewish population unintentionally by annexing neighboring territories as part of its imperial expansion. And oops, those territories happen to be home to substantial Jewish populations. So France acquired most of its Jews, especially its Ashkenazic Jews, by expanding to the east and acquiring what we now call Alsace-Lorraine, which is where most French Ashkenazic Jews live. Germany acquired its most significant population, or I should say Bavaria acquired its most significant population by expanding to the south. Russia acquired its very large Jewish population completely unintentionally, and regretted the fact, by annexing larger and larger chunks of Poland at the end of the 18th century. So the story of how Jews became subjects of country X across Europe is actually remarkably similar. They became subjects because those countries expanded their imperial reach. And Imperial Russia under the tsars also employed many recognizable techniques from European patterns. So they placed restrictions on where Jews could live, both within individual towns and cities and also within larger regions. In the Russian case, these restrictions created a territory known to you as the Pale of Jewish Settlement, this enormous territory in the western borderland of the Russian Empire, in what is now Poland, Ukraine, and Lithuania. Some people refer to the Pale Settlement as a gigantic ghetto. Well, the gigantic part is right. The Pale Settlement was larger than France. So if you have this image of Jews packed into these tiny little winding streets, that's not the Pale Settlement. The Pale Settlement was an enormous territory. And it's also not really like a ghetto because Jews never comprised more than 10% of the population of the Pale. That's where all the Ukrainians and Poles and Lithuanians lived. So the ghetto analogy is not quite right, even though the principle of residential restriction was the logic that made the Pale. And the idea was really to keep Jews out of Russia proper, the Russian heartland, away from the western borderland. The Tsarist regime used laws about what occupations Jews could take up and which ones they couldn't, just like the French and the Germans and other European countries did. They restricted Jewish ownership of real estate and property. just like European countries did under their old regimes. And they insisted on collective taxation of the Jewish community, separate Jewish taxes on Jews, by Jews, to be delivered to the treasuries. All of these are the standard toolkit of how old regimes governed their Jewish population. The only thing that really stands out in Tsar's policy, at least until the late 19th century, is that under Nicholas I, they imposed a military draft on Jews without making them equal to their non-Jewish counterparts legally in return. So it was all take and no give. This was the traumatic episode in the 1820s in which Jewish boys as young as 8, 9, 10 years old would be drafted into the Tsar's army for a period of service of 25 years. A genuine collective trauma for the Jews of Imperial Russia. That's really the only outlier in the toolkit that the Russian government applied to its Jewish population. And the conforming to European patterns goes further than that. If you look at the timing of emancipation, all the way from France in the West to Russia in the East, it's almost as if someone had written the script in advance and everybody followed it. Because in all of these countries, it took seismic shocks to the political system to bring about emancipation. And the two leading seismic shocks were revolutions and military defeats. Those were the things that destabilized governments enough to make them consider something as radical as making Jews legally equal to their non-Jewish neighbors. And in this sense, Russia is following the script to the letter. It's just that the shock wave came so much later to Russia. Russia didn't have a revolution like the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. 18th century. It almost alone, it and Britain alone somehow managed to insulate themselves from the wave of revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848. And most importantly, Russia didn't lose major wars. The only war it lost across the entire 19th century was the war in Crimea in the 1850s. And that was on its periphery. It really didn't affect Russia proper. It never came close to destabilizing the government. So one of the ways of thinking about why emancipation comes so late to Russia is that it's not until the Bolsheviks and not the Bolsheviks. It's not until the provisional government in February of 1917 begins this wave of revolutions across that year in Russia. It's not until the revolution gets to Russia that we have Jewish emancipation. So far, we are really right in sync with the European trajectory. It just takes a little longer to get there. But the mechanisms are completely recognizable. Okay, so that's the part where, as we do this comparative analysis and try to think about whether Russia is an outlier or not, that's the part where it's not an outlier, where it really does seem to conform to a larger pattern. Now I want to walk you through the things that are distinctive about the Russian case, and this is what makes, I think, the story really interesting. I want to draw your attention in particular to three different elements of this story that are pretty much unique to the Russian case. One of the consequences of being late to the party, of considering legal equality for Jews after pretty much everybody else has already done so, is that the Western example is already available to think with. And Jews in Russia and officials of the Tsarist government all were taking very careful note of what was happening in the West. They saw that these countries were emancipating their Jews. They saw Jews rise in prominence in the worlds of commerce, finance, and journalism, and arts and letters. So it's as if they were watching, one version of their own possible history play out next door. And this had a big impact on people's thinking about what was desirable, what was possible, what Russia could and should, or couldn't and shouldn't do. The thing that's distinctive about the legal status of the Jews in Russia is that certain Jewish elites in the empire tried to adapt the European example to their own circumstances and persuade the government to inaugurate a kind of locally inflected version of emancipation. Let me try to spell out what that means. As I mentioned, emancipation in Western Europe typically took place in the wake of revolutions and or lost wars, military defeats, military catastrophes. And those events were almost without exception aimed at dismantling that hierarchy of social groups with different laws applying to different people. Russian society was nowhere near ready to do such a thing. And even at the beginning of the 20th century, there were different laws for the Russian nobility, for the Russian peasantry, for the clergy. That social hierarchy of the old regime was unchanged. So Jewish elites, and particularly wealthy merchants, the most important of whom was a man named Horace Ginsburg, decided that if the Russian government would offer certain legal equality to Jews who qualified for it by proving their usefulness to the state, you could set up an incentive structure whereby poor Jews, or as they were called, useless Jews, in the very brutal language of the Enlightenment, the emphasis on utility, they would have an incentive to become productive and useful to the state and to their communities, and they would be rewarded for that by being given legal equality with whatever social group in Russian society they corresponded to. So Jewish merchants, if they paid enough taxes, could qualify for the legal rights of their Russian counterparts. It's a very complicated story. I started to uncover this when I worked in the archives in St. Petersburg in the 1990s and early 2000s. What I found there, among other things, was a large number, dozens and dozens of petitions by Jews to the Tsar's government saying, would you please grant the privileges of the merchantry or other social groups to Jews who qualify? And that way we can have what I later came to think of as a kind of selective emancipation or selective integration. Not all Jews would be given these new legal rights, only those who qualified for it. But by staggering those privileges or forms of equality, you could transform the Jewish population, make it more modern and more useful. And again, I'm simplifying a very long, complicated story, but over the course of the 1860s and 1870s, this is exactly what the Russian government did. It was part of a larger campaign of trying to modernize Russian society. They freed the serfs. Tens of millions of serfs were brought out of that status and became peasants and potential landowners. They created a university system. They created an independent judiciary. And alongside all of these very deep and powerful social reforms, the legal status of a certain portion of the Jewish population changed as well. Who do I mean? Well, start with the merchants themselves. So Horace Ginsburg negotiated with the Russian government so that once you crossed a certain threshold in the amount of taxes that you paid, and you were a member of the merchant guild as a Jew, you then had all of the same rights as Russian merchants, including, and this was the key one, the right to live outside the pale. And so large numbers of Jewish merchants flocked to the commercial centers of this empire. It has two capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, way outside the pale. A second group that receives this privilege, and again, this was done with utility to the state in mind, were Jews who graduated from Russian universities. So the idea was if you got a degree from a Russian university, you too could live anywhere in the empire you wanted. Because the Tsar's state was hungry for well-educated people. It had to staff its civil service. It wanted to stimulate the economy, entrepreneurship, what have you. So university graduates were a second group that qualified for this privilege of living outside the pale and legal equality with other university graduates. The Russian interior, and remember the Russian interior is vast, 11 time zones, 6,000 miles from east to west. The Russian interior was short on certain kinds of artisanal labor. It was short on manual labor generally, but it particularly lacked certain kinds of artisanal labor. And legislation was passed in the 1870s that said Jewish artisans who do this or that kind of work, if they're shoemakers or carpenters or what have you, they too have the right to live outside the pale and to stimulate the economy of the Russian interior. And finally, a group that, in a sense, had already paid its dues to Russian society were those Jews who survived the 25-year military service in the Tsar's army. If you served your full 25 years, or I should say, if you lived after you served your 25 years of service in the army, you could live outside the pale. So I'm leaving out some of the smaller categories, but these are the largest four categories: merchants, university graduates, artisans, and veterans of the army. These four groups, given the right to live wherever they wanted in the empire, and by the end of the 19th century, again coming back to that first really reliable census of 1897, we know that over 300,000 Jews had moved outside the Pale of Settlement into the Russian interior, most of them to Moscow and St. Petersburg. We'll never know how many Jews made that move illegally, because after all, if you didn't graduate from a college or you weren't the right kind of artisan, you were still very tempted, because Moscow and Petersburg are Moscow and Petersburg. Would you rather live, sorry, I'm not going to offend anybody, I hope would you rather live in Kalamazoo or in Manhattan? Would you rather live in Babrisk or in Moscow? That's what we're talking about. So I would estimate that another several hundred thousand Jews lived illegally outside the Pale, sort of piggybacking, despite the law, on these loopholes that had been created for these special so-called useful categories of Jews. So this is what I mean by selective emancipation. Not the Jewish population as a whole, but maybe about 10% of it by the early 20th century. So think for a minute what the impact of this kind of policy would have been on Jewish society. You're basically creating two different classes of Jews: those who are subject to all of the discriminatory laws against the Jewish population, and those who are told they get a pass. They can live where they want, they can own property, basically equal to whatever their equivalent in the Russian population is. So by staggering emancipation in the Russian Empire, a kind of hierarchy was injected into Jewish society itself. And a tremendous amount of resentment of the privileged Jews went along with that hierarchy. You all know that Russian Jewry is famous for having produced radical movements and radical thinkers, right? The Bund, Jewish Labor Union, the prominent Jews who peopled the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks and other radical revolutionary parties, where Jews were vastly overrepresented in comparison with their proportion of the population as a whole. I think, if you're in this building, that this is what Russian Jewry was famous for, among other things, was producing a lot of radicals, revolutionaries, socialists. But what they were reacting to was not just the Russian environment, but to the stratification and hierarchy that was injected into the Jewish world by this piecemeal, partial, extremely partial form of emancipation that was the result of a kind of negotiation of unequals: Jewish elites on the one hand, the Tsarist government on the other, both of them trying to make Jews, as they would have put it, more useful to society. So what were the results on the ground of these policies of selective emancipation, selective integration? I'm going to throw out some numbers to you now, just so you can get a sense of what the impact was. I need to put my clock on so that I don't lose track of the time. So by the end of the 19th century, 15% of all university students in the Russian Empire, that means 1 in 7, was Jewish. And the percentage of Jewish women among women students in institutions of higher education was even higher. By the end of the 19th century, as I mentioned, over 300,000 Jews lived outside the Pale legally and probably a number close to that lived there illegally. By the end of the 19th century, more Jews in the Russian Empire were studying in universities, secular institutions of higher education, than were studying in yeshivas. By the end of the 19th century, a third of all the lawyers in the Russian Empire were Jews. So if your image of Russian Jewry are people wearing raggedy clothing in the shtetl herding cattle, think again. The story of modernization begins before 20th century and before the Russian Revolution. Jews played a leading role in the development of the railroad networks in the Russian Empire. They played a leading role in the spread of banking and credit networks in the Russian Empire. When Russia finally got its first parliament, its first experiment in national representation of the population as a whole, 12 Jews were elected as delegates. And my favorite illustration of this weird coexistence of an old regime society and a majority Jewish population that is still subject to what are basically medieval restrictions on where it can live and what kinds of property it can own. My favorite illustration is that one of those elected delegates to the Russian parliament, the Duma, which first convened in 1906, in his first speech to the Duma, he said, "I'm actually not allowed to be in St. Petersburg. I'm just here to help make the laws for the country." This was in the memoirs of Shmaria Levin. So it's this bizarre coexistence of medieval legal disabilities aimed at Jews with a very selective attempt to mimic the European pattern of emancipation. Why did this happen so late? Why was Russia able to stretch this process out and do it so selectively, so conservative, cautiously? Well, as I mentioned, it just took a long time for seismic shocks to come to Russia, the kind of shocks that had dislodged old regimes in Europe. And that has, I hardly need to tell you why. It's because Russia is big and powerful. It didn't tend to lose wars, and it wasn't subject to having its internal politics dictated to it by other countries. You know, emancipation comes to a lot of Central Europe when Napoleon brings it with his armies. But when he got to Russia, he did not attempt to emancipate Jews, as he had done in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and many of the German principalities. When the Congress of Berlin met in 1871, Bismarck and the other 1878, Bismarck and the other delegates were able to force many of the small countries of the Balkans, so Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, to grant their subjects legal equality. Romania proceeded to yank it back immediately, but it's not uncommon in European history for smaller states to have Jewish emancipation forced on them by other countries who are exporting their own practices. It's a very rough parallel, but I want to suggest that it's not unlike the way the European Union acts now. Want to join the European Union? You need to conform to dozens and dozens of legal requirements, among which are you can't discriminate based on race or religion. There's a whole host of European Union requirements that are the sine qua non to entering into that group. Nobody could dictate policy to Russia in that manner. And that allowed Russia to postpone over and over again and to stretch out over time its mimicry of Jewish emancipation in Europe and do it very partially and very selectively. Okay, so this is where we are at the beginning of the 20th century, where Russia has very selectively imitated certain elements of the European pattern in an attempt to maximize the utility of their Jewish population. There's already a backlash against this. I mean, when 1 in 7 students is Jewish, quotas can't be far behind. And sure enough, by the 1890s, quotas on the admission of Jews to Russian universities were already legally in place. And I don't mean unofficial quotas and conversations in back rooms by the admissions committee. I mean like public laws. Jews will not constitute more than 7% of the student body at universities outside of Moscow and Petersburg, and in Moscow and Petersburg, the most prestigious cities and universities, 5%. All out in the open. Everybody knows about this. It's not done behind closed doors. The legal profession also decides, it really doesn't look good when every third lawyer is a Jew. So they begin to limit the admission of Jews to the bar in order to have a more ethnically Russian legal profession. And it's all done out in the open. You can use laws to do anything. And this is what happened at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there were, in effect, two Russian Jewries. There was the one that benefited from this selective form of legal emancipation, and then there was the rest. And the rest was somewhere between 80 and 90% of the population. And as I mentioned, this injected enormous tensions within Jewish society. Okay, now I want to spend the rest of my time, and I don't have much left, talking about the 20th century, and in particular, the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. The first thing I have to make sure I get right, because I misspoke before correcting myself, is that it wasn't the Bolsheviks who emancipated the Jews. Jewish emancipation in its full European form, one law, all Jews affected, was delivered by the provisional government. That's the government that came to power in February of 1917 when Tsar Nicholas II resigned and his brother refused to take up the throne. And all of a sudden, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was over. Just like that, in one night, it was over. So the provisional government, which consists mostly of members of the Duma, the parliament, plus a few army generals, they take over, they start running the show, they start prosecuting the war, right? Russia is still part of World War I. And by March of 1917, they have enacted a law that bans all discrimination, all legal discrimination based on nationality or religion in the Russian Empire. So it's not a Jewish-specific emancipation, it's a general emancipation. And in one legislative act, they dismantle the entire edifice of different laws for Muslims and for Jews and for Catholics and Russian Orthodox. I mean, the Russian Empire is like, it's the world in miniature. Every major religious group is represented there. 100 languages are registered in that census of 1897. This is one of the most kaleidoscopically diverse societies that has ever been. And in one legislative act, all discrimination based on nationality and religion is dismantled. Passover of 1917 was like no other that had been celebrated in the Russian Empire, because for the first time, all the Jews of the Russian Empire could celebrate their freedom. This was European-style emancipation across the board, reacting to the shockwave of the revolution. And it is as if, belatedly, Russia had finally arrived at the emancipation moment. But the February Revolution turned out to be the first two revolutions that year. The second followed in October, when the provisional government had discredited itself by not getting out of the war and by taking up the same war that the Tsar had gotten entangled in, and the war was going just as badly for them as it had for Nicholas II, and all of the discrediting that happens when a government is losing a war and the army is failing miserably. And it's in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks take over power from the provisional government. And this is where things take a sharp left turn away from anything that European history has ever suggested. Because the Bolsheviks are also an emancipatory force. Their whole reason for existing is to emancipate humankind, capitalism. That's what the Bolshevik Revolution is about. And all of a sudden, a totally different agenda of emancipation is now on the table. And to make matters even weirder, Bolsheviks, as they begin to govern from 1917 on, do not adopt the general modern principle of one law for everybody. They return in a new key to the much older medieval pattern of treating different portions of the population differently on a legal level. So if you are the offspring of bourgeois parents or of the clergy, you don't have the right to vote, because only workers and peasants are going to have the right to vote in this new Soviet state. So it's as if Russia took all of 8 months between February and October of 1917 to experiment with a really recognizably European style emancipation. And they've decided, that's it, we've had enough of that, moving on to the next phase. And the Bolsheviks embark on this extraordinary experiment of re-hierarchizing society from a legal standpoint. And there are large categories of people who are stripped of full citizenship rights. They can't run for office and they can't vote in elections. None of these restrictions are ethnically or religiously based. They all have to do with social origins. This, after all, is a party and a government that is ruling in the name of class, of the workers. It just so happens, however, that since large numbers of Jews, as a hangover from the Tsarist era, engage in small-scale commerce trade, they are disadvantaged by this new legal regime, because those are the petty bourgeoisie that the government is trying to strip of its voting rights. So again, 8 months, and then it's as if you're back to square one. Only it's not really square one, because the rules of the game have changed. Once again, the Jews find themselves in a society that is handsomely rewarding some of them and punishing others. Portions of the Soviet Jewish population do fantastically well under the Soviet order. They once again flood into the universities. And now they're not only achieving remarkable numbers in the legal profession, medical profession, every sector, every white-collar sector of the Soviet economy has extraordinary Jewish presence in it. Journalists, agronomists, statisticians, academics, and on and on. Anything that requires not just literacy, but higher forms of learning, Jews are doing fantastically well. But it goes beyond that. They're doing fantastically well in terms of membership in the Communist Party. And even more, they are way overrepresented in the security services, the so-called Cheka, the precursor of the KGB. In no other modern state, apart from modern Israel, founded in 1948, in no other modern state did Jews achieve such a powerful presence in the inner sanctum of power as they did in the early Soviet Union. It's an astonishing phenomenon in the party, security apparatus, in white-collar professions. And sure enough, before too long, as in the late 19th century, there's a backlash against that. Stalin, among others, becomes concerned that the party looks too Jewish, and that there are too many Jews in the university, and they're crowding out space from other ethnic groups. And by the time you get to the post-World War II era, another set of quotas has been instituted, only this time not legal, but unofficial, sotto voce. No one declares it out loud, but everybody knows that it has suddenly gotten much harder for a Jewish young woman or man to get into a university, especially the prestigious universities, Moscow and now Leningrad, as Petersburg has been renamed. It's as if, I hate to use this phrase, but it's as if history is repeating itself. This pattern of trying to deploy Jews in the larger project of modernizing society produces such a wave of Jews entering high status professions that it triggers a backlash. But this is in fact what happens in the Soviet Union. And it's astonishing because the Soviet Union, I probably don't need to remind you, was the first anti-Semitic state on the planet. It was the first government that officially declared its opposition to anti-Semitism and enforced that position, really went after people for anti-Semitic speech or acts or other forms of discrimination. And yet this same state, and need I mention the state that defeated Nazi Germany, that contributed to the crushing of the greatest threat the Jews have ever faced, this same state engages in a backlash that looks awfully like what happened in Tsarist Russia at the end of the 19th century. It begins in the late 1930s, gathers tremendous force in Stalin's last 8 years in office between 1945 and 1953 when he dies. So what should we make of this remarkable pattern? The Russian state has repeatedly come to see itself as threatened by the consequences of its own efforts to modernize Russian society, to expand access to higher education, to open doors to greater social mobility, to reward entrepreneurship. And it must be said, or at least I'm going to say it, that significant portions of Russian society have shared that sense of ultimately being threatened by such forces. I think the pattern that I've described is clear enough and pronounced enough to constitute one of the deep structures of Russian political culture. And that means it's in the same category as the other deep structures: the weakness of legal institutions, the persistence of very personalized forms of power, and a generally anemic population when it comes to political engagement, along with the public cynicism that inspires that anemia. I'm not saying that these deep structures are inescapable or inevitable or eternal, absolutely not, but they are deeply embedded in Russia's history to the point where we need to take them seriously, not just as regards Russia's past, but Russia's future. And now I'm going to conclude with something I probably shouldn't do, and no historian should do, and that is to speculate about that future. Vladimir Putin is a political thug. He is almost certainly now a war criminal. And like it or not, he is the most philo-Semitic, Jewish-friendly leader Russia has ever had. I'm going to say that again. Vladimir Putin is a political thug, probably a war criminal, and the greatest philo-Semite that has ever ruled Russia. Under Putin, Jews in Russia have enjoyed as a group greater legal protection than in any other period of Russia's history, with the possible exception of the 1920s, the first decade after the revolution. They have enjoyed access to institutions of higher education, freedom of worship, entrance into the professions, and into positions of entrepreneurship as great as in any other era of Russia's past, again with the possible exception of the 1920s. Many of you will be aware that a remarkable proportion of the so-called Russian oligarchs that we read about, or used to read about, these are the usually very Kremlin-friendly titans of Russia's business community. A very large proportion of them are of Jewish origin. Oh yeah. A very large proportion of Russian oligarchs who have close ties to the Kremlin are of Jewish origin. Russian nationalism right now, under the latest doctrine of reclaiming what they call the Russian world, Ruski Mir, is currently ascendant and is currently in full martial mode, full military mode. But I do think the day will come when Vladimir Putin will no longer be the person who sets the tone for Russian nationalists. Someday, maybe in the next 10 to 20 years, Putin is now 70 years old. He'll turn 71 in October. Someday there's going to be a post-Putin Russia. I think that in the post-Putin Russia, the historical pattern that I've identified will repeat itself. There will be another backlash targeting Jews, or perhaps other non-Russians. There are a lot of non-Russian minorities in this country still. People who can be cast as internal enemies with suspicious connections to the outside world. People who can be cast as disproportionately taking advantage of the opportunities opened up to them by the Russian state itself. And it's anyone's guess how Putin's successors will manage that backlash. It gives me absolutely no pleasure to say this, and I would very much prefer that my speculation turn out to be wrong. But even if it does turn out to be wrong, I think the deeper patterns that I've tried to call to your attention in my remarks tonight offer an important lesson in the history of emancipation. As important, as vital as legal emancipation is and has been for Jews, by itself, it is not and cannot be enough to preserve their security and well-being. History, and not only Russia's history, teaches us that emancipation is reversible. Thank you. Before I take questions, before Miriam takes questions, I just wanted to let everybody know that NYU Press is in the process of publishing a 6-volume history of Jews in the Soviet Union, 2 volumes of which have already come out. State-of-the-art, very, very good scholarship, highly readable, and anyone who wants to pursue the topic further, I could only recommend this series. Truth in Advertising, I'm on the editorial board. I didn't actually write them, but I helped usher them into publication. But really top-notch scholarship. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much for that very interesting and informative discussion. We'll start with our president.
Yes, that's membership has its privileges.
More than membership, right?
Well, so here's my question, and those who are here may know that I'm very fond of counterfactual questions. So picking up on the idea of speculation about the future, if we speculate about the past, for example, and ask, structurally speaking, with regard to the development of Russia's political culture, if the Pale of Settlement had never fallen to Russia in the 18th century with as late as 1795, I think, the final partition, and if the vast majority of Jews in Eastern Europe had stayed under Polish rule, would Russian Jewish emancipation with a much smaller population have structurally unfolded differently, and was part of the problem the very mass of Jews in Russia, which of course would have meant counterfactual that the bulk of Eastern European Jews would have been under Polish rule and under a different political culture with a different political history? Can one envision any scenario where both countries would have benefited had the Pale never come into existence?
Very interesting question. Ideally, I'd have a little more time to think about it, but let me try to sort of walk you through, in real time, my thought process. Thank you for. There was very little sort of indigenous anti-Semitism in Russia for the simple reason that most Russians had not encountered Jews. It was only when they had accidentally acquired this population territories that sort of began that relationship. So I don't think there was anything hardwired in the Russian system that would have produced the first outcome. The size of the population is significant. I mean, 5 million is what they call a non-trivial number. That's a very substantial population, even by the standards of the Russian Empire. But more than the numbers, I think, what really distinguished and would have distinguished the outcome in the case that you raise, insofar as I can sort of imagine that, is that Russia was an empire and Poland, at least by the end of the 18th century, was not. And in general, Jews fared better in empires because empires were more diverse. They weren't trying to impose a single national identity on all of their subjects, which sooner or later became the goal of nationalists everywhere, whether they were French or German or Polish. Whenever I try to think through a counterfactual, because I'm an historian, I'm always sort of grabbing things that actually did happen to try to think with them. So there was a period in the interwar era between the First and Second World Wars when Poland tried to assert its identity as a nation state. It had just broken free of being part of the Russian Empire for over a century. It was as if an entire country was resurrected and reappeared on the map of Europe. Things did not go so well for Jews in independent Poland between the wars. So I certainly don't think the outcome would have been better if the Jews of the Pale Settlement had remained under Polish authority than they did, rather than what actually happened. But again, I would need more time to sort of play that out in my mind. This is edge of the envelope, or whatever the expression is.
First of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Then I have kind of couple of questions. You hear that I was born in Russia.
Daniel?
Yeah, so I have a huge family, a lot of histories. Everything is more or less I know, but what surprised me very much, what you said, that before the revolution, every 7 student was Jewish from living there half of my life, whatever, and knowing so many families. Anybody who wanted to get education went to European universities. My whatever relatives went to Warsaw Conservatory and all other stories. And give me any example of any famous persons who graduated from Russian universities, please.
Sure. First, you're absolutely right that large numbers of Jews who couldn't get into Russian universities or for other reasons chose to study in Europe, not just in Warsaw, but in Berlin and in Paris, and in Brussels and in Switzerland. You want an example of famous graduates of Russian universities who were Jewish? Well, I'm not sure you will have heard of them, but a man named Genrich Slezberg, who was a lawyer and became the head of the legal staff of that same Baron Hans Günzburg that I mentioned. And he was the architect of many of those petitions that produced the system of selective integration. Maxim Vinaver, a prominent literary critic who did the first important study of Pushkin, speaking of the cultural inner sanctum, was also a graduate of a Russian university. He ended up converting in order to get in. And conversion, of course, would let you get in. Once the quotas had been instituted, conversion would let you get in outside the quotas. One thing that I can say that might clarify your experience of dissonance over this is that the total number of university students in Russia was not great. It was not huge. So to be 1 in 7 didn't mean that there were tens of thousands of Jewish university graduates, but the proportion really was 15%. And that's what produced the backlash of quotas. Many people who grew up in the Soviet Union, whether they were Jewish or not, grew up with the impression that Tsarist Russia was just one catastrophe after another for the Jews, and that it was the Bolsheviks and the Soviet system that emancipated them. What I'm trying to suggest is that that is not entirely accurate. It's not entirely wrong either, but there were important loopholes that were the exception to that, and those loopholes turned out to be highly significant. The legal profession, the medical profession, and on and on.
Yeah, I have 2 quick questions. So where do the Karaites, Krimchaks, Mountain Jews, and Bukharan Jews fill into the subject of emancipation? And second question, you mentioned President Putin was the most philo-Semitic president in Russian history, except for the 1920s. But I thought that the Bolsheviks outlawed Orthodox Judaism in the 1920s. They closed down synagogues, circumcision. So that means President Putin is better than the 1920s.
I didn't compare Putin to the leaders of the 1920s. I compared the fortunes of the population in the 1920s to that under Putin today. Putin, you're right, Putin has protected religious worship and in fact has forged alliances with Chabad and other traditional groups in the Jewish world that would have been unthinkable by any other leaders, Soviet, Russian, pre-revolutionary, whatever. It's simply off the charts. But I didn't mean to give the impression that the index of religious freedom comparable between now and the 1920s. Because yes, Bolsheviks did very well for secular Jews and very badly for religiously observant Jews. Oh, I'm sorry, the Karaites and the Bukharan Jews. So in this, as in so many other regards, it was an old regime society. Different laws applied to Karaite Jews. Karaite refers to a subgroup in the Jewish world that does not recognize rabbinic authority. They are sort of the Protestants of the Jewish world. They only consider the Bible, Hebrew Testament, the Hebrew Bible, to be the legally binding source. And because that was appealing to certain Christians, Karaites actually had a higher legal status, a more expansive legal status in the Russian Empire than what was then called rabbinic Jews. That is the overwhelming majority of Jews in failed settlement. Old regime societies don't have a problem with a patchwork being one law for people in this province, another law for people with this occupation. It doesn't have to be uniform mindset. So the Bukharan Jews and the Georgian Jews and the Mountain Jews and the Karaites all had it better legally than Jews in the Pale. But I really didn't have time to touch on their paths at all. So
first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And my question is about pogroms. So you didn't mention at all. So we all know about pogroms. That was the moving force of the Jews leaving Russia in early 20th century. I would like to know how the government was treating and reacting to pogroms.
sure.
Thank you.
Well, we think we know that pogroms were the driving force, but actually they were not, or they weren't the dominant force. And this is something where extremely good historical scholarship has been done, beginning with the late Hans Roger at UCLA, followed by Michael Stanislavski at Columbia and others. If you do a careful mapping of the timing of emigration from the Russian Empire to choose your destination, Europe, North America, Israel, it does not, the pogroms alone cannot explain it. Of course, they were a factor, but I think a much more pervasive, less event-driven, but not less powerful factor was endemic poverty and the search for a better life. And in some cases, the urge by young people, and the immigrants were overwhelmingly young and single when they left, the urge to leave what they perceived as the stifling world of Orthodox shtetl. So emigration is a complicated phenomenon. It's not a single variable equation. There are lots of things that go into it. Pogroms are one of them, especially when they are clustered, as they were in 1905 and again in 1918. But the actual causes are much more complicated than just ethnic violence. You asked another question about the Russian government's reaction to pogroms. Again, another thing that historians have uncovered is that, contrary to popular impression or popular mythology, the Russian government did not instigate pogrom violence. The Russian government, even when it was anti-Semitic, hands down, no questions asked, the Russian government, like most governments, did not like public disorder. Did not want people rioting and looting, because those situations often get way out of control. So the Russian government was not an instigator of any of the major pogrom waves. Not in 1871 in Odessa, not in 1881 up and down the Pale after Alexander II was assassinated in Petersburg, not in Kishinev in 1903, and not up and down the Pale settlement in 1905 in connection with another revolutionary wave. But the Russian government certainly could choose how to react to pogroms, doubt. And there's lots of evidence that, especially in certain local settings, local police refused to take action against pogromchiki, the perpetrators of the pogrom, and simply let things play themselves out, kept things within certain limits, and did virtually nothing. Not only did not aid the Jews in their moment of distress, but never really took seriously the idea of compensation for loss of life and property. There were many, many lawsuits by all those Jewish lawyers I was telling you about that happened after the pogroms, after things had been looted and stolen and destroyed. And the Russian government never supported the idea of penalizing the loss of Jewish property and life. So in that sense, it was, it participated in the guilt of those events, but it didn't instigate them. We know that pretty certainly now.
Hi, I would like to know to what extent you feel that anti-Semitism is baked into Russian society, despite Putin's, views.
It's hard to say because we lack really good data about Russian public opinion, especially in the last few years when people are afraid to say certain things. to admit certain things. I'm very cautious about phrases like baked into, hardwired, because it implies a certain eternal, almost genetic quality that I really don't think is accurate. And I'm very uncomfortable as an historian saying anything about genetics. That's not my métier. That's not what I do. I don't want to pretend that I do it. I myself have seen lots and lots of advertisements for apartments to rent that say Slavs only people of Slavic origin. But I think it's safe to say that overwhelmingly those are not targeted against Jews, targeted against people from the Caucasus. There's a lot of racism in Russia, a lot of garden variety racism, and in some cases it includes Jews, and in some cases it really targets people totally unconnected to the Jews. But Putin, through a combination of dog whistles and very public association with Jewish leaders, rabbinical leaders among others, and also I should add through his association with the Jewish Museum in Moscow, which I helped design. Putin donated a month of his salary towards the construction of that museum. The main donor was Jewish oligarch number one, Roman Abramovich. This is a fantastic museum that Putin insisted bear the title Museum of Jewish History and Tolerance Center. Tolerance Center. He wanted to use his philo-Semitism as a platform to promote ethnic tolerance in Russia. Now, who doesn't like ethnic tolerance? And we all know that Russia needs ethnic tolerance because even now, after all those non-Russian republics broke away, the Russian Federation is still a fairly diverse society. It's 80% ethnic Russian, but it's 20% other stuff. And Putin, before he started to look like such a war criminal, which he certainly does now, looked like a very sort of savvy leader who understood that for Russia to flourish, you couldn't have ethnic riots. You couldn't have pogroms against minority populations if you wanted this to be a modern, flourishing society. So he placed himself quite visibly in the company of Jews. There are biographical reasons for this, going back to his childhood and a teacher that he had. He is a philo-Semite. And he sets the tone. I mean, it is kind of a dictatorship now. And so what the dictator says and does, and even more important, what he doesn't say, is important. That's why I made my final point, that once Putin is gone, which, he's mortal like the rest of us, so he will be gone at some point. Once he's gone, I think a much more typical version of Russian nationalism will percolate up to the surface, and it's going to be much uglier than the one we're seeing now.
I think this will be our last question. We're running out of time. So.
Hi. You said that the oligarchs are of Jewish origin, but you didn't say that they were Jewish. So
quite a few of them, not all of them, but a very significant proportion of them.
Are Jewish?
Of Jewish origin.
Right. Okay. So are of Jewish origin. So I was just wondering, when in their family history did they leave the Jewish religion, and why?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, the vast only a small minority of Soviet Jewish families maintained religious practices. It was dangerous to do so. Teaching of Hebrew was, it was never legally forbidden, but it was practically forbidden. It was extremely dangerous to teach Hebrew. People were being put in jail. There was a strong underground current of Orthodox religious practice throughout the Soviet period. Chabad never left the Soviet Union entirely, maintained underground shuls and synagogues. There were practicing Jews in the Gulag. The vast majority of the Soviet population was not observant, and levels of Jewish literacy dropped catastrophically after the Second World War. So I use the phrase Jewish origin in, frankly, the Soviet sense of what nationality was indicated in people's passports. Roman Abramovich is of Jewish origin because his parents were legally
nationally Jews. Everybody had a nationality in the Soviet Union. Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian, Georgian, Jewish, Belarusian, you name it. It's the Soviet sense of Jewishness that so not religiously observant, and in most cases not religiously literate, Jewishly literate, but of that origin. And of course, for some people, that means a tremendous amount and creates the possibility of recovery or return or reanimation of certain ways of life and certain ways of knowing. And if you include that category of people of Jewish origin, a lot of the oligarchs do it.
I'd like you all to join me in thanking Dr. Benjamin Nathan.